Hey everybody, welcome back to Music Corner. As always, I'm your host, good ol' Dick Whitman, and today's subject matter we're dealing with is 10 of the worst records I've ever had to review, as well as what makes bad music, because it's kind of a difficult term to define, and there's a lot of different ways that music can be bad. We cover a couple of different ones, 5 exactly, in this list here, and there's a lot of music that may sound bad when it comes out, but turns out to be ahead of its time. I think pretty famously, Lou Reed's Metal Machine music is a great example of the turnaround that record made from being just panned as one of the worst records of all time to all of the respect it has now. The same could also be said about Farrah Abraham, who we've talked about on the channel before. Her dubstep experimental pop concept album about teenage pregnancy was not nearly as appreciated in its heyday as it has been retrospectively, with a lot of people who never heard this thing when it first came out lending their ears to it and really enjoying it. Now, I've only been reviewing albums since the beginning of 2017, so there isn't going to be any Speeding Bullet to Heaven on here. There isn't going to be any Corey Feldman, Angelic to the Core on this thing, even though yes, those albums are bad. I didn't get to listen to them right when they came out and deliver my thoughts on them, so I don't consider them amongst the worst albums that I've ever reviewed. I've got 10 on the list today, and I'm going to try and break down some different ways that these records indulge in their terribleness. 5 categories, 2 records each. We're going to jump right into it. So the first category, it may seem like an obvious one, is music. It sounds bad. It just sounds bad. And I know what you're thinking. Every bad record must sound bad, right? But not necessarily, and we'll get into that, and we'll get into why some records that have better pristine sound quality, or maybe a concept or more attention given to them, still end up being bad records. But today we're going to deal with 2 albums from bands that I wish would just stop. I'm already dreading this. The first one, I don't know what I was doing in February of 2017 that I had enough time to review this record, because it's not a band I'm a fan of, and it was one of the first records that right when it came out just blew me away with how much I hated it, and it's, oh Jesus, the Dropkick Murphys album, 11 Short Stories of Pain and Glory. Ooh. Yeah, my problems with this record, the whole thing. This might be my least favorite of the 10 records we're going to talk about today. At least this is the worst category, because there's just nothing redeemable about these albums. I know that Dropkick Murphys had that song that worked really well in The Departed, but I've never really heard a Dropkick Murphys song that I thought, wow, that's really cool. That makes me want to pump my fist to it, which I think is the whole point of their music, but it comes off just so corny and overwritten and absolutely unbearable. This may be like the worst of all of them. I haven't heard all of Dropkick Murphys' music. I don't know why I thought I should listen to this thing, but I think it was one of the first really, really bad scores that I ever gave out, not counting that Pink Guy record. Speaking of that Pink Guy record, I should mention I'm excluding comedy albums, even though there's stuff like Pink Season and anything Lil Dicky's done, and that Doug Walker The Wall nostalgia critic thing that is certainly some of the worst music I've heard in the past couple of years, but it's not really intended to be good. It's meant to be funny. It feels like judging it for criteria that it just doesn't really fit. But back to the unbearable badness of albums that just don't sound good is one that I'll say I didn't have high expectations for. I was a little bit excited about because I love the band in their heyday. Violent Femmes with the record Hotel Last Resort. Jesus Christ. This band released an album back in 2015 or 2016 that the critics just panned, just absolutely hated it, and I listened to it. It was before I started reviewing records, and I thought, this isn't terrible. I kind of see what they were going for. There's a couple tracks that I like off of it. It's not completely miserable, which part of is what made me a little bit excited going into this record here, Hotel Last Resort. But I definitely think this is the worst album I heard in 2019. I don't do a worst albums of the year list. It doesn't interest me that much. I don't seek out bad music. But wow. was Hotel Last Resort terrible. Bad songwriting, weird, kooky performances, terrible ideas that just don't work at all. I know I just said the Dropkick Murphys record was corny, but Jesus Christ, this record is corny too. And if anybody who has heard ever heard this record before does not want to experience a bout of PTSD, you might want to cover your ears while I talk about the track "Sleepin' at the Meetin'," which kind of makes my stomach hurt just like saying it out loud like that. One of the worst. It's just worst things, songs, sounds. Ugh. God, it reminds me of that Avalanche's Messy Eater song, in just being such a weird, awkward combination that it makes my ears hurt to listen to it, and I don't want to talk about Hotel Last Resort anymore, or ever again. The next category of how an album can go really, really poorly is the genre crossover album. Now, I know when I say this, a lot of people think of really miserable, like, rap, rock collaborations. Logic's Supermarket is obviously a big one. Kid Cudi's Speed and Bullet to Heaven is like the poster child for that. But I'm actually going in a different direction with two bands that I've never been the biggest fan of in the world, but have commendable back catalogs that people really enjoy, both of whom switched up their sound way late in their career to just disastrous results. Starting with the worst of the two, Fall Out Boy, with the album Mania. Now, I've been a pretty vocal critic of Fall Out Boy, even though I enjoy some of their Folie à Deux, Cork Tree era music. But boy, when they came back and reformed as this really kind of embarrassing, triumphant radio rock band in the 2010s, I thought, this is terrible. I hate this. What are they doing? Why did they come back to do this? They can't possibly be passionate about music this forgettable, instantaneously bland, and just underwritten and underperformed and underthought out. But it actually got way, way, way worse on this dubstep, electronica, like EDM record, Mania. It's so obvious that Fall Out Boy just does not care about this music. There's none of the edge that the band had in their heydays here. None of the fun that the band was clearly having in their heyday is here. And that misery and debilitating just grudge to make music that sounds like this is so apparent, so obvious. It's hard not to feel it as the listener and think, why the hell are they doing this when it sounds so terrible, and they clearly sound like they don't want to, and everything just comes out like awful as a result. I don't know, I can't really explain this. I don't even think it was trend chasing, because a lot of the contemporary EDM and dubstep trends that they were chasing were gone by the time this record came out. So what's the point? It's just kind of embarrassing at that point. And another album, very similar, rock band that I was never head over heels for, although a much more commendable rock band than Fall Out Boy. I'm talking Linkin Park, their final record, One More Light. Now, in light of what happened after this record, it's a bit of a sensitive subject, but I just have to wonder what anyone was thinking going into this. I don't think anyone thought this is going to be the final Linkin Park statement, this is going to be the end of it, but oh God. This is just the band that had been slowly working their way out of the original sound through which they wrote their name on, and looking for something to grow into. But instead of growing as a band and making music that was more appropriate for the messages that they wanted to say, they kind of just made a wreck that's like really wants to be contemporary and wants people to like it, but is so unlikable. Obviously, the artistry here can slightly be commendable at some points, but the execution is just disastrous. The next pair of albums that I want to talk about are under a category that I'm calling no effort, which is where no effort is put in whatsoever. And I have a little bit of a left hook for the second album, but for the first record, when I said the words no effort out loud, I'm imagining a lot of you probably thought of the same record, the Lil Xan album, Total Xanarchy. Is this thing overhated? Maybe a little bit. Is it the worst album of all time? Probably not, but it is one of the worst albums that I've had to listen to over the past 3.5 years that I've been doing this. Almost 4 years, that's weird. Yeah, it's just like no effort. I don't know any better way to put it other than no effort. Most of the songs have beats that are really, really generic and feel like they didn't give any effort. The lyricism, if you could call it that, is so repetitive and mundane and just lifeless, and it's not even the trap format, because you gotta hand it to guys like, say, 6ix9ine or Lil Pump, who have refused to shy away from making dumb, simple, repetitive music, but they do it in a way that is often incredibly engaging, sometimes even thrilling. But Lil Xan decides to strip all of that life and energy out of the music that he's making and just wallow in empty, emotionless nothingness. How he got any of the features that he pulled on this album to agree to be on tracks this mediocre, uneventful, and uninspiring, I have no idea. And I'm just so curious where Lil Xan is gonna go next. It's been a little bit now since this record came out. For some reason, morbid curiosity maybe, of all the artists on this list, he's one of the only ones that I actually genuinely would like to hear a new record from, just because it can't be this. It can't be worse than this. The next one, it has to have a pulse, right? It has to have something, anything. Please, Lil Xan, your fans, we need more. No, we don't need more. The next record here that I felt had no effort put into it is not no effort on the part of the producers and mixers and sound designers who worked on this thing, because they really did turn it into one of the most unbearably overblown albums I've ever heard in my life. The people who put no effort into this were the band themselves. I am talking about the 30 Seconds to Mars record, America, an album that I imagine most people have forgotten about since it first came out, but this thing just stuck with me for how much it tries to fake enthusiasm and genuine grassroots momentum and energy, and it comes off so poorly. Like, these songs are loud, they want to sound emotional, they want to sound grand. It really felt like the band was trying to do something really definitive here, but it's like they didn't really care about it. They only wanted it to sound like that. Most of these tracks sound like they were recorded in one take, passed off to someone else who didn't really give a shit and was paid to slap the rest of it together. And the result is a record with no momentum, no engaging songs, no interesting ideas. It's just bland, it's just effortless, it's just so mundane. It beats you over the head with these lifeless sensibilities over and over and over again, while it's trying to tell you how grand and important and impactful it all is. It's just a mess. If you have 40 minutes or so to sit down and listen to this thing, I wouldn't recommend it, because you're not really going to get anything out of it, except for maybe a sense of disappointment once all is said and done, that there actually isn't anything on this record that lives up to the grand promises the band makes. Alright, 4 more records to go, and this first category, these next 2 albums, are coming from a category that I'm going to call too old for this shit. There's no reason why bands cannot release great records later in their career. However, it is rare that those records are the same style, the same approach that band was making in their heyday, because trends change and people get older. I mean, that Judas Priest record from last year or the year before that sounded straight out of 1982 and was amazing is one in a million compared to all of the bands who either attempt to redo old sounds and fail miserably, or change their sound either to something even worse that they're less equipped for, or if they're really doing it right, changing their sound to something that they're more accustomed to and that they're more appropriate, age appropriate for at that point in their career. These bands did not do that. First off, Blink-182. Now, I love Blink-182. I grew up with Blink-182. The run of albums from Enema of the State, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, and the self-title. I love all three of those records. I like all three of those records. I think they're pretty good. I understand why people make fun of Blink-182. And it has not been Blink-182's decade. Their first attempt at a comeback, the Neighborhoods record, was dry and forgettable, and a lot of people pretty much forgot about it immediately as soon as it came out. But the next round was somehow even worse. Now, I don't hate California. I think it's a tolerable record. I think it's a decent pop-punk record. I think it's at least a modest attempt at trying to capture some of what the band's original appeal was. It's 9. It's 9 that is, like, the worst. It's the worst. It's just the sound of Mark Hoppus and company being too old for this shit. I mean, you can tell that none of this is coming from a place of youthful rebellion or emotion anymore. It's so focus grouped, it's so generic, it's so wannabe embellished, and it wants to make you feel something, but it's coming from people who clearly aren't feeling anything, and the result is just pop punk pap without any of the emotion or the flavor or the catchy hooks or the funny songwriting or the great jokes or the lewd inappropriateness that makes pop punk often so fun. And when you strip all of that down, what you get is just fucking unbearable. Speaking of fucking unbearable, only 2 records from this year, 2020, made it onto the list, and this is one of them. Well, Blink-182 took their pop-punk roots and tried to commercialize them a little bit and make a more pop, less punk version of their sound. Green Day did the opposite on Father of All. Well, I don't even know where to start with this record. This is the most boomer shit I've heard all year. Like, God, that sign that the no Swedish producers, no 100% uncut rock. Fuck me. This album was terrible, and I wanted to like it. I thought that Revolution Radio was a decent way to see the band aging and writing songs that still had the core of their sound to it, and not all of them were great, but they were at least sounding appropriate. This is not. This record sounds terrible, tacky, corny, overproduced. They wanted to make pure uncut rock so bad, but there's the spirit of rock and roll. The spirit of rock and roll is gone. It is devoid. It is missing from this record. It does not exist. That's all. It's just sad seeing them try to make this rager of a record, and the results it's just pitiful. I hate it. The last category we're going to talk about today is what I call radio bait. We have one example of it working and one example of it not working. This is basically music that is so focus grouped, lifeless, dull, so clearly made without the interest or care of anyone involved, that was just trying to get plays, get streams. It is clearly music as a business decision with absolutely nothing else, no artistry involved whatsoever. And we're going to start with one of the most successful examples of all time of this, Ed Sheeran's Divide. This thing and its lead single Shape of You obviously dominated streaming, and it is because the music is so approachable, so accessible, so impossibly hooky at its worst moments, that people who will just chew it up like brain dead nonsense and stream it. Oh God, I hate that this record was like successful and kind of impactful, because it's so easy to tell that Ed Sheeran, his producers, his songwriters, nobody gives a shit about any of these songs. There's no emotion to them. There's no edge to them. They couldn't be more low impact. They're just tolerable. It's just one song that is tolerable as background noise to switch your brain off to and to let it melt a little bit to the sound of Ed Sheeran's singing voice over and over and over again for about 45 minutes. And I've always been a vocal critic of Ed Sheeran and his music, and I thought it just got worse and worse and worse as his career went on, but I think this has to be the worst. I can't foresee him going on to make a record that is worse than this. Even that Collaborations project, which sucked, at the very least it had a lot of people's voices on it who weren't Ed Sheeran, some of whom who were actually trying to put together a pretty decent song. None of that shows up on Divide. And finally, the final 10th record we're going to talk about today, an album I bet a lot of people haven't heard, an album I bet a lot of people haven't had the chance to appreciate for its unique badness. I wrote a very hostile review about this record online. I know the band tweeted about some of the negative criticism that they had received for this record. I like to think I inspired some of that, even though I probably didn't. I'm talking about Grouplove with Healer. This has to be the worst record I've heard this year. Worse than Green Day, or that Wire record, or that Dominic Fike record. I'd rather listen to any of those again before I gave any more eartime to Healer, because god damn, this album is just, it's just like the worst. It's Grouplove wrote trite, kind of shallow, but catchy and fun and energetic and joyous pop punk early in their career. I actually like their debut record, even though I haven't really liked anything since. This is by far the farthest the band have fallen, because there's nothing else here but those really trite attempts to write dull, meaningless songs with these whack-ass verses. There are so many whack-ass verses on here. The songwriting is so amateurish, but everything builds into this grand attempt at a hook, almost all of which fall flat because they have no momentum, and once again, really trite, meaningless songwriting to back them up, and it is absolutely brain melting and mind numbing. If you're looking for any kind of stimulation out of Healer, you're better off listening to the Lil Xan record. And I mean that because this thing is not just background noise so lifeless and apt that you can turn your brain off of it and enjoy it. It's background noise that doesn't work as being background noise because it's so audibly bad at doing so. At least you could close your eyes and kind of drift into the void of that Ed Sheeran album, but this void is like hurting you. It's a black hole. It's my bones are crushing even if I'm trying to ignore this record, because it's all you can hear is this hook and it doesn't work, and all you can hear is these verses and they're whack as fuck. Here's this loud ass instrumental. All of the blaring synths and quiet drums on this album blow my mind. Who produced this? Who put this record? Who released this? It's no wonder nobody listened to this album. It's making me dizzy talking about it. That's 10 for 10 out of 10 records that are all perfect, and I recommend that you listen to all of them. This will be on the test, and you have to do it all before the next video I put out, which is probably going to be the September and October recap, unless I push it to November. I don't want to make a 45-minute recap, and what's the point of it being a recap? So I'll probably do another recap in a couple weeks, talk about all of the bad, disappointing records that have come out over the last 2 months, and like the 2 good ones. So look forward to that. Besides that, I hope you enjoyed. If you go out of your way to suffer through any of these albums, please tell me what you thought of them and what particularly about them made you groan or hurt in similar ways that I did. And as always, thank you for watching.